Why don't we kick off? I'm Adam Isacson. I am the Director for Defense Oversight here at WOLA, which means I do a lot of things. But one thing that I've kept an eye on for the last 20 years or so is U.S. security assistance to Latin America. Much of that, more than 80% of it over those years, has gone in the framework of the drug war. And in particular toward eradication of crops in Colombia, Bolivia, Peru. And this continues to be a front and center issue. About, I believe it was 2 weeks ago, the White House announced that in 2017 it detected 209,000 hectares of coca in Colombia, which is a new record. It broke the existing record of 2016, which was just 11% lower. It's the fifth straight year of increases in coca cultivation in Colombia. And it's become a real front and center issue. I mean, when you go to Colombia, it's just growing up to the roadside, up to the riverside. You see it everywhere. But this is the latest chapter in a rather long story. The green line here and the blue line there show the U.S. and UN estimates of coca cultivation in Colombia for the last 20 years. And you've got this sort of frustrating W-shaped graph going up and down and up and down. Record amounts of cocaine being interdicted, an up and down pattern with an increase in the amount of tons of cocaine being produced. Not much overall change, adjusting for inflation and purity in the price of cocaine on U.S. streets over the years, but a large amount leaving now, mostly through the Eastern Pacific, but mostly through the maritime route, coming through Central America to the United States. I'll just leave, why don't I leave that chart up? Now, what underlies this? I mean, a lot of, folks like us, NGOs, critics of the policy have said that, you're going to be always on a stationary bicycle until you do something about the lack of state presence in the areas where coca is grown. That, people with no rules, no access to infrastructure, no land titles, they're always going to be sort of in this situation, especially in agricultural frontier zones where coca is one of the only viable choices. Now, this book, which Paul Gutenberg will talk about shortly, Liliana Dávalos is actually traveling all the way down from Stony Brook today and is going to be a little bit late, but she'll be joining us presently. This book is sort of a corrective to that state presence narrative, or at least a partial corrective. I mean, it makes the point that actually the state governments are what got people into these marginal or agricultural frontier zones to begin with, and then sort of lost interest. And I'd actually like to hear more about how that happened. The state came, said you should live in these areas on the edge of the Amazon, and then kind of left. And why was that? Cold War priorities. This also has led into this sort of chicken and egg debate about deforestation. Is coca cultivation the cause of deforestation? Is it the other way around? Or is it some other set of causes? But now I think this is this book that has just come out last month on Routledge, edited by Paul and by Liliana, is really timely. Because with what's happening with coca in Colombia and to some extent elsewhere in the Andes, that's become now a major part of the discussion here about how to proceed with U.S. policy toward Colombia. You've got a new government coming to power in Bogota. Questions about whether the new model that the peace accord of 2016 presented is going to get a chance to even be tried in this context, or whether it's going to be sort of just drowned amid the rush to do something about the present moment. So, I mean, what do these books' lessons tell us about how to proceed now? So, Paul Gutenberg is chair of the history department at Stony Brook University. I'm delighted that you're able to come down and present the book. I was even more delighted to be able to have the opportunity to write a short epilogue to the book, sort of just talking about the present moment. But I think you all and this discussion, we've got a lot of knowledge in this room about coca history and U.S. policy. I hope that we can do a far better job than I did trying to sum up the present moment. Oh, thank you, Paul.
We are recording because this will go up on the webpage, so
okay.
Please speak into the
All right. Well, thank you, Adam, for that introduction. I did want to note what a real honor it is this is the first presentation. In fact, this is the first time I've ever seen the book. The first presentation, it's an unveiling of the book, but what an honor it is to do this here at WOLA, because really since the time I started working on drugs 20 years ago, WOLA has always been at the forefront of where the progressive discussion is about the Andean drug crisis, and it seems to be an ongoing crisis, as those scary graphs are telling us. Just one caveat about the book. It's almost a joke. The list price of this book is, you wouldn't believe it, is when they come out in hardback, is obscenely expensive. So the purpose here is not to get you to buy this book, but it is giving me the irony of finally having a book that's almost worth its weight in cocaine. I think. I mean, I haven't been keeping up with prices, but
It's only about a gram.
it depends. I'm sure the market in Colombia, it's about this. Anyway, let me just quickly give you an overview of the book, where it came from, and then maybe some of the implications that we see, though I'm a historian and not a political scientist or anything fancy like that, so I try to limit my predictive value. Liliana, who will be here shortly, is a biologist, but she's had a great deal of policy involvement in environmental policy and drug policy, so she might actually be able to speak more directly to that. But let me just, first of all, tell you what the origins of cocaine is, and I'll make this one bold claim here, which is that this is the first book to try to really pinpoint exactly how this vast illicit economy of cocaine began. Apparently vaster than ever. And here's the story. In the 1950s and 60s, the Cold War governments of Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia launched these agricultural colonization projects in the Amazon, in the areas that are called Oriente or Selva or Montaña or Yungas, the near Amazon. And they built roads and they had services, they gave incentives to campesinos to go down there. And in the next decade or so, tens of thousands of campesinos in these three countries went down to these zones. But by the 1970s, for a variety of reasons, and what Adam says is correct, it's like, why do these things happen is a good question. The case studies help you a little bit there. All of these modernization projects failed or were abandoned by the state. And what that did is it left these large pockets of peasants in the Amazon, alienated, in three places in particular, and there'll be places that sound familiar to you. The Huallaga Valley, the Upper Huallaga Valley, the Chapare, and Meta, and Guaviare province in Colombia. Why are these places familiar to your ears? Because fast forward 10 years from there, these are the three epicenters of what are going to be the cocaine booms of the Andes. Despite the fact that Peru, Bolivia, and Colombia have very different political regimes during all of these periods, and despite the fact that they have even more radically different, say, ethnic regimes relating to coca. So the cocaleros, in my view, that came out of this process become the social base and the driving force for the cocaine trades that are going to follow, and they themselves were a product of this kind of failed development, okay? Now, why is this interesting at all? Well, as a historian, I can say it's interesting because it's kind of a new fact that's been established here. But I think it's more than that because it does challenge, or at least nuance, I'm with Adam on that the answers are not all that clear. What are the vague truisms that are always given for the formation of illicit economies, not just in the Andes, but actually used throughout the world? And these are usually that it originates from a deep, original isolation from the state. Second, that it comes from a lack of development or sheer, kind of immiseration, peasant poverty. or from some kind of ties to conflict goods or smuggling routes. And these are the truisms that still underline today what are the perceived solutions to illicit economies, such as so-called alternative development. But I'll try to give something more on that at the end. So that's the book in a nutshell. The origins of the book are kind of interesting to me, at least, because it's an interesting story of synchronicity between two scholars, although one is not here yet to respond to this. It's kind of unusual for a historian and a biologist to collaborate. But I had been thinking about this for quite a while because some of you know I published this book about 10 years ago called Andy and Cocaine, the Making of a Global Drug. I can barely remember the name of it now. But when I was doing that book, I noticed this peculiarity about in the Guaviare Valley, and that was this explosive role of this tiny little place called Tinga-Maria, which had been a colonization zone and also had been a centerpiece of U.S. economic aid in the region because there had been a U.S. agricultural station there dating to World War II, actually, where trying to develop crops and agriculture for the Amazons. At one time, it was the largest U.S. agricultural station in the Western Hemisphere. It's got an interesting story. I mean, I don't want to get lost on that, but it was really interesting. It later became there's a Universidad Agrícola, and that also attracted people down into Tinga-Maria. Anyway, so when I saw this about Tinga-Maria, I began to wonder for years after the book came out, I wonder if there's anything similar going on in Bolivia, in the Chapare, and Colombia was just this vague area. Like, Colombia is too complicated for people like me. It was like the geography of Colombia. And I wondered, is there anything going on similar in these regions about development projects? So I finally assembled a bunch of scholars. I found the right people to do it, who did case studies of Chapare and of Colombia. And we met at LASA, and lo and behold, and this was when Kim Theeden, who many of you might know, we began working together on this. She's an anthropologist. She's a real anthropologist. The book is listed as an anthropology book, but there's not a single anthropologist in it. But it was striking, the similarity between these three countries and these three modernization project areas. So at that point I decided, let's put this together into kind of a book. Meanwhile, and Liliana can tell you her side of this story when she gets here, my colleague in the biology, she's an ecologist. We had talked about these issues occasionally, and we had once talked about, we should do something together on coca, because I knew she worked for the UN World Drug Report on environmental issues, and did I mention that Liliana's from Colombia, from Meta, actually, at one point? Yes, her family was from Meta. Anyway, one day we met on the train, because there's a train out there, and she says, I just published this quantitative article in Bioscience. You've got to see. I used, I think it's 594 municipality data sets in order to run the regressions against the blah, 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 blah. And I found these old maps from the 1970s, and I did some geospatial analysis. This is how scientists are. And you know what I discovered? You were right. These modernization projects are the origins of cocaine. And she had published this article in Bioscience. Very quantitative article. So at that point we decided, we are using completely different methodologies, but we should really combine our efforts. And so Liliana and I decided to edit this book. And though she's not right yet here, it's been a pleasure working with her because she's a brilliant, not just scientist, but she has this brilliant interdisciplinary mind and fantastic editor. And what's amazing when you work with a scientist, so I recommend it to everyone, is they're technological wizards. There's like nothing that they can't do on a computer. And so like we did an index in one day, just sitting there like that. So but she'll have her side of the story. So just quickly, I don't want to take up too much time unless you want. The structure of the book is, I'll just map it out for you. The core of the book remains this idea of these three in-depth, archival-based case studies of Bolivia's Chapare, Peru's Huallaga, and Colombia's Meta by a deeply interdisciplinary group of scholars, but then kind of sandwiched between larger interpretive chapters, okay? So the book has two introductions. There's one by me, which takes a kind of a historical and interdisciplinary perspective on the issues, probably explains them much better than I've explained them right here. And then Liliana does the same thing from a conservation biologist perspective of looking at the ways in which deforestation patterns in the Andes. This is Liliana right here. Hello.
Hello, hi everybody.
Hello, welcome.
Hi, I saw a truck blow up on the New Jersey Turnpike. Yeah, we watched it, like we watched this plume of, this giant plume of smoke blow up.
That's otherwise my favorite road in the world.
I think it happens all the time.
It happens all the time, but I'm
Anyway,
here.
welcome. So
Thank you.
I've been explaining, but have you seen this? This is the actual book.
That's the actual book, no, I
That's
haven't
what it
seen
looks
this.
like.
Check it out.
But I'm gonna finish the overview,
Yeah,
and
of
then
course, go
I think
ahead.
you get your, I kind of explained the major thesis. Adam gave us an introduction.
Awesome.
I explained the major thesis of the book and the origins of it, so you have to tell your origins story. And I'm just mapping it out, and I'm gonna give a few implications, and then I can pass it to you.
Right.
But these three case studies, which are archival and ethnographic, interesting sources. The first one is by two Peruvian sociologists, Maritza Paredes and Hernan Manrique, is about the Huallaga Valley, and they're really interested in the ways in which international developmental ideas and Peruvian agrarian politics kind of converged in pushing Peru towards developing the Amazon. Okay, why send the campesinos down to the Amazon? The next chapter is by a historical geographer, named Andrew Millington, who's a specialist on Bolivia, and you may not even know that there is a field called historical geography. It's small, but super interesting. And he looks at the Chapare, and he basically is able to map and periodize the rise of coca and coca frontiers within the Chapare. And one of the reasons he's able to do this with great precision, and this is something that historians and scientists are doing more and more, is that there's a whole new, very Cold War source that they're able to use, which are photographs taken from outer space by the U.S. spy programs of the 1960s onwards. I'm trying to remember the name of the satellite that he was interested in particular, but you once mentioned that to me many years ago. The Corona photographs, which are now, it's a lot of work, but you're able to use them in books like this. Then we have a chapter which is another type of introduction to Colombia by a group of political economists, Jennifer Holmes, and this looks at the ways in which the cycles of coffee and business in Colombia were part of the push down to colonization fronts in Colombia. And then the next chapter is about Colombia's specific major project, which was called Meta Numero Uno in Ariari. And that's by an ethnographer and historian named Maria Clara Torres, and she follows the rise and fall of the experiment or the colonization project in Guaviare. She happens to be a doctoral student at Stony Brook as well. And then finally, although he just left the room so I can say whatever I want about it, Adam's fabulous afterword, which is, worth where he did a very good job of putting it within the context of, well, what do people do now? And the ways in which there's always pressures for short-term solutions like eradication, as opposed to the types of long-term solutions that are suggested by the history of coca. Anyway, to reiterate, Adam just missed that, so I just described your brilliant chapter. Oh, anyway, to reiterate, the basis of the book are really these three in-depth archival case studies surrounded by interpretive guides of one form or another of what we think this means. Okay, anyway, let me just get a little bit, and before I pass it to my colleague, about the implications. I think Adam's right, they may be controversial if they're stretched too far. But what's wrong with a little controversy? Okay, so look, since this is a rather overpriced book, our goal is not to make you buy this book.
Although it would be great if you did.
I was not going to say that. Get your libraries to buy it,
Get your
especially
library, yeah.
if you're at some very wealthy institution like the CIA. Please get your libraries to buy it.
I think the ebook is a lot, the electronic version is a lot better value. to be
45
honest, you
or
know,
something like that.
Yeah, $40 on Google, so.
Yeah, we don't even want to say the price, but we do want the implications of this to be felt or discussed by people in the field beyond history and beyond biology, and institutions that work in these areas. And there are other implications, but let me just touch on three of them. One of them that Adam kind of mentioned at the very beginning, in a very similar ambivalent way that I would, which is if illicit economies were actually born from failed modernization and development, this actually implies that you really have to rethink the idea or have some nuance to the idea that NGOs and the UN and anybody else who's not just into the warfare mode has of alternative development. It can't really be a panacea, or it can backfire. Development needs to be done with care, with sustainability, with very long-term investments in view, because look what could happen if development fails again, which seems more than likely, right? Secondly, a slightly different issue is if illicit economies are the result of a perverse result in the classic social science sense of state projects or state withdrawal, and it was Francisco Dumi, actually, who was one of the first people to articulate that view about Colombia. This also suggests that there has to be a great deal of nuance to the broad idea that all that we need to do to end illicit activities is to fully integrate people on the ground, on the grassroots, into the state. And perhaps, and this is a direction that maybe Liliana can take this, rather than promoting development in some of these zones, which everybody knows now are areas of rather low productivity in terms of agriculture, maybe it's important to promote other things such as conservation. Just throw it out the window. It's okay. It happens to everybody. That's Francisco too. So anyway, so think of this as a conservation rather than a developmental frontier. And thirdly, one of the most interesting things to me as a historian of this book was if failed development I know there's a neologism to narcotization. Seems to be a pattern here in the Andes where it's very, very clear. What about other cases? Is there something more general that's going on here? And yes, actually, this was another thing that you and I found like in the same page. It was very odd. is I was looking mainly at Latin America. I was going, oh yeah, there are parts of Mexico where this is true, where the withdrawal of the agrarian reform, or Paraguay, the cannabis basket of Paraguay used to be a coffee development zone. But the one area that's really a standout across the world, we're not saying that all drugs come from failed development, but the one that's really quite striking is Helmand Province in Afghanistan. More than half of the world's heroin. And yet, in the 1960s, Helmand Province was the model developmental project of USAID in South Asia. It was an irrigation zone, cotton, and it all went bad, of course, for very similar reasons, ecological reasons, salinization, and that led to thousands and thousands of people settling there, and, well, we know the results today. So there are some parallels in other parts of the world that's oddly, we both picked up on that, the Helmand Province thing, we found that out. Anyway, I'm gonna stop here and pass the, it's not really baton, it's
Do we need to use a microphone for the camera? Okay, so
To
somehow that's gonna
Liliana.
advance, so I'm gonna,
We can stretch this.
yeah, we
Liliana
can stretch,
Dávalos.
we can stretch that one over here so that I can know what is being projected. That's a good idea. Okay. All right, so that's fantastic. It's very, very cutting edge. So I'm coming at this problem from a different perspective, and my perspective is coming from the environment, and especially from forests and forest frontiers, which in Colombia, but it's also true of the other two Andean countries, cocaine-producing Andean countries, those frontiers also coincide with these deforestation frontiers, and have so for the last 50, 60 years or so. So this is a headline from last year. This is the rate of deforestation in Colombia has skyrocketed. It will be very hard. So Colombia received, in the last 3 years, has received on the order of $200 million of international monies, mostly from Germany and Norway, with this dual purpose of nature conservation and crop eradication, illicit crop eradication. So they have been like twinned. These things were twinned. And I'm afraid to say that some of the reasons why these things have been conflated have to do with my own research, my own past research. A long time ago, when I was Alvarez, for example, I wrote this paper. Look at that nice exponential trend, right? Like it seemed at the time, so this is writing like at the late 1990s, early 2000s, there's such a tremendous amount of growth in the Colombian crops as they are reported by different international organizations that it seems like they're going to take over the entire country. And so again, coming from this concern of the forest, and the question was, is this going to really destroy all the forest? How is it possible that there are some researchers coming out and saying that for every hectare of coca, there's like 4 or 10 or whatever number of other hectares of forest that have been chopped down? So I run some of the math, and I concluded that it actually couldn't be, but the growth was exponential. So then we published a more nuanced study from 2011, and in this paper we came to the conclusion that coca was deforestation. Here's a headline from Manga Bay, but it was also highlighted by National Geographic and others. And it's the idea that in southern Colombia, which is, of course, where Putumayo, or it's the region where Putumayo, Caquetá, Guaviare, all of these places are, we're finding this very clear spatial signal that there was an excess of deforestation. It wasn't just the places that got chopped. You know, the forest is not only cleared just to have your coca crop, but actually places that were nearby also were cleared at a much higher rate. And that was the first time that there was a quantitative analysis. There's some pictures, the aerial pictures that you see there are actually from Peru. So these lines of research and this vision of how coca crops are actually a threat, an environmental threat, have coalesced by now by 2010 or thereabouts. They've coalesced into these international programs that are saying we are going to conserve the forest and fight coca together. Like it's the same thing. It's the same money. Like we don't need to choose between one or the other. Like we're going to do the same thing. So I was asked by the United Nations in 2015 to actually run an assessment of environmental issues that surround not just coca, but also Afghanistan and Myanmar. So I was looking at the entire world, but of course a lot of the research. So I made a series of, I set out for myself, one of the things that happens when being asked to do such a thing is that the people who are funding this were actually the same people who had just paid $200 million. So they had a lot at stake, right, in the narrative that these things went together. And I can understand why they picked me, probably, assuming that I was just going to take all those papers I had published and kind of like write them out together. But I decided to instead look at the evidence more, systematically and quantitatively. And so one of the things that I found, so I made a series of predictions. I said the rate of deforestation should be high in places that have coca compared to other agriculture. Countries that have coca should have a much higher rate of deforestation. The periods of time that have more coca also should have rates of deforestation that are higher. And the coca cultivation, the amount of coca that we see in a particular province or area should be covariant. It should covary with the rates. So I set out these predictions, and then I started examining them one by one, and these are plots that we got. And so you can see here, regions of each one of these countries that have coca cultivation and the regions that don't, like in Bolivia, in Peru. And then you can see right away that there's really not a lot of difference. So in red is the regions that have coca, and in blue is the regions that don't have coca. And in terms of statistical analysis, which is sort of one of the things that I do, it really doesn't jump out as showing the coca just having that higher rate. So we have similar rates of deforestation, at least for the 2000s. So the only country that differs in that is Bolivia. We'll get to Bolivia. Then I also tried to look, and this came out in the World Drug Report in 2016, so I tried to look at areas that were at different spatial scales. So instead of taking like entire provinces of the country, like at the scale of the landscape, do we see the rates of deforestation from coca being exceptionally high in these places? And you can see the rates of deforestation from coca are in red, and the rates of deforestation from other things, especially from pastures, are so much higher. They're like 100 times higher, and sometimes they're 10 times higher, so much higher. So, and then in Bolivia is the exception, and in Bolivia is where we find that the boom in coca, so the tolerance for coca that's shown there in green, the period of tolerance for coca is actually corresponding to greater rates of deforestation. So it's an outlier relative to the other things. But the problem with doing an analysis like this is that it could be that these periods also correspond to periods in which you're building more roads, or it could be that these are periods in which there's some kind of more mining going on. So you don't really have very good controls. And the best data for that are from Colombia, because Colombia has a lot of socioeconomic data that are available that one can control for. So in other words, we can't really chalk up all the deforestation rates just to the coca presence. We also have to think about everything else that's going on. Particularly road building is really important. So there's these 3 different studies that are mentioned there. They're completely different labs. We use different satellite imagery. And what we end up finding out from those data sets is that actually there was no covarying. So in other words, the amount of coca that is planted in a particular region is not a strong predictor of the amount of deforestation that region is going to have. And these 3 independent studies found the same thing. And we also controlled for different areas, et cetera. So now I'm going to skip a bunch of this because there's just too much detail, and I think this audience is going to get bored with the level of detail that is here. So I'm going to skip ahead to this. And to talk about the case of Guaviare, which is a study that we published a few years ago, in which we're trying to distinguish between 3 causes of deforestation. So again, it's that narrative that I played some role in instituting at some level in saying, coca is a very important driver of deforestation, but there's also the idea that cattle, that pastures are the ones that are driving deforestation. And then there's another hypothesis that's about the systems, the structures, And these structures are really important because these structures are what ties with development. Because it's economic development. Economic development means transforming these natural landscapes that are supposedly public or belong to the state or a public, and then transforming them into properties that actually pay taxes, but also can be traded, and people can buy and sell them and make money off of them. So it's a transformation of this forested frontier from natural habitats into properties is one way to look at it. So I made a series of predictions about what we ought to see, 3 hypotheses with 3 sets of predictions. So if we think that it's like the land tenure system, then we should be seeing this demand for land, more pasture, more cattle. if it's the what we call the hamburger connection, or it's really like the cattle, the demand for beef should be the predictor. And if it's coca, it should be the demand for cocaine. It should be, the coca. And so this is what we observed. So I want you to focus only at the very top. You can see the forest is declining. So this is this is 10 years worth of data in the different areas of Guaviare that we studied. And the forest is declining, the pasture is increasing, but the coca is also declining. So right there off the bat, we have, again, counter to all of this discourse of the coca is the thing that's destroying. To take photos. My students are here, and I'm asking them to take photos. So counter to all of that, we're actually seeing that the coca is disappearing, as the pastures are increasing. And there's a series of other measurements there that are. So the most important thing that I wanted to do was actually also test this notion of the pastures. Like, what are the pastures really doing? Are the pastures about cattle? Is it because there's this vibrant cattle economy? There's this huge demand in Bogota that's being somehow met by Guaviare. And these are the plots. So we see that the amount of cattle is actually increasing by the tens of thousands. So it's like increasing in a major way across the municipalities that we're studying. But you can see the price of beef doesn't show any indication of a rise in demand. So if we have this rising demand, and if people were actually putting the cattle into the pastures because they have this rising demand, then we should be seeing these prices somehow rising or slightly, and we don't really see any change. You can see those are real prices. And in fact, the GDP that corresponds to cattle, so has actually plummeted over the same period. So people are clearing pastures, and they're putting cattle in them, and there's no way to make a profit off of them, or the profits are really low. There's like very little income coming from them, at least that we could see. So the demand for beef is not a good explanation. Revenue from beef is also plummeting. As I said, the coca cultivation is also disappearing. It's got no relationship with eradication either. I mean, that's something that I think everybody about this table is probably sympathetic with. You could say, well, look, all the coca is declining, and it's all because eradication has been so effective. This is the plot showing the relationship between eradication and cultivation. And the answer is there's no relationship between the two whatsoever. So, whatever they were doing, spraying or whatever, that's a giant waste of money. The coca is declining on its own, right? So what is really happening? Well, what's really happening is that this part of the world is developing. It's late. It was supposed to develop in the 70s when there were these programs, but it's happening now. Right now, like in the 2000s, that's when it's developed. So what's happening is the coca cultivation is declining. There's a very strong relationship. You can see it here. And the population is becoming urban. So instead of living on the land, on their farms or whatever plots of land they have, they're actually concentrated in the urban center more and more with every passing year. And there's no coca, right? The coca declines and declines. So the coca is this frontier thing, this kind of frontier thing that happens when you're not urbanized. And once you actually have urban centers and you actually have all this other economy, the coca, again, disappears on its own. Remember this, right? So we know about this. So what's happening? So what we found that the tax base was growing. So the top graph is the property taxes, the middle graph is the construction GDP, and the bottom one is financial GDP. So this is all development. What we're looking at is a region of the country that's undergoing financial, economic development and urbanization. That's what we're seeing. So there's a lot less dependence. Part of that picture is that the revenues are coming now from other sectors, like they're coming from construction, they're coming from finance, and there's therefore less dependence on this ranching and agriculture, this kind of primary sectors. So Guaviare is a developing area. 40 years after the plans, it's become a developing area. So the key points is that the catalysts have to do with improvement of the roads, but there's also this expectation of urbanization that we believe, and this is something I don't have charts to show it because it's actually really hard to document, but there are also land grabs, widespread land grabs that are happening in the region. They're not, as land grabs, they're not peaceful, right? This is a pretty bloody business. There's also agricultural tech that has arrived in the region. So in other words, it used to be that cattle ranching of the kind, like low productivity cattle ranching of the kind that's being shown there was the primary sector, but thanks to a series of agricultural advances in the early 2000s, it's now feasible through inputs to actually have things like sugarcane, maize, and oil palm especially. So you have this kind of giant capitalist agro-industrial enterprise, and that's what's clearing the forest at a much higher rate, together with the land grabs instead of the coca. In terms of what we're interested here in this forum, well, it's interesting along two different lines. One is that coca is not the driver of the deforestation, and then another one is that the coca is disappearing because of economic development, or in tandem with economic development, not because of the giant aggressive intervention of eradication. And I think that that's something that we're going to see more and more in different regions. Of course, from my standpoint of conservation of the forest, of course, this is not a wonderful scenario, because you actually have, you actually end up with very little forest. Like if you look at the forest percentage, we're down, we go from 50% forest to 25% forest to like 10% forest in a very short period of time in Guaviare, but it's something that we're beginning to see in other parts. So the thing that inspired me in the direction, after kind of having this bigger picture and trying to take on that assignment of evaluating for the United Nations the effects, the environmental consequences of illegal crops, what really struck me was this map. So the map that you see on your left, that is a map. If you ignore the red, the little squares are the government-sponsored development projects, right? And this data set comes from a series of dissertations by German-speaking students from different universities in German-speaking parts of the world. So in Switzerland and in Germany, they were writing these dissertations, and it was different people. So some people were focused on Colombia, some other people were focused on Bolivia, some other were focused on Peru. And one of them, actually two different people, published this same location. So they have the localities of the development projects throughout the region that are tied with the Marginal de la Selva road, right? So Marginal de la Selva, I don't know how much you talked about it.
I didn't mention it, but
you didn't mention it.
The tie-in between these three development projects in the Andes is that there was a larger vision of connecting the western edge of the Amazon through a road called the Carretera Marginal de la Selva.
Marginal de la Selva.
And an obsession, particularly in Peru, of President Telaunde from the late 1950s onwards.
And this is really important. It's really important to bring back Marginal de la Selva into the picture, because Marginal de la Selva, so each of these countries had an interest for whatever reasons, like this is a period of agrarian, really big push, populist movements for agrarian reform in each of these countries. There's a real, rapid population growth in each one of them. There's pressure that's coming. It's coming from mechanization of agriculture, so you don't need as many people on the land anyways, and so people are migrating into the cities. And the safety valve that pops up in each one of these countries is like, look at all that land we've got in the Amazon. Look at all that empty land. That land is empty, right? So it's this vision of going east and the confluence of technologies. But I think what makes Marginal de la Selva catalytic, which I hope the next slides, so what makes Marginal de la Selva really catalytic, and this is a quote from 1966, is that in saying we're going to connect from Santa Cruz all the way into Venezuela, right? In bringing that up, then it opens up the floodgates of international financing, right? So each of the countries independently, Colombia can have like inflation-financed works, and Peru, each of the countries can have its own little investment, and even local roads, even like local jurisdictions are trying to open up and build the roads. But it's only when this Pan-American vision, this sort of development vision that encompasses more than one country and it's meant to open that market, the entire market, that's when the international money comes in. And it coincides with the Alliance for Progress, it coincides with this period. So that's why I think it's important to think about Marginal de la Selva, not because independently each of these countries would have had some level of colonization and would have had those roads. There's no doubt in my mind that access roads would have existed, right? But the level of financing that went into the specific projects and the promise of those projects among the general population, which at the time, Colombia had something like, fewer than 20 million people, and there were actually 10 million people documented seeking land. So we have like a huge population. That's Colombia that we have the statistics for. We have a gigantic percentage of the population that is starved for land, or that they're seeking some kind of solution to the campesino problem. We have similar pressures in the other countries, right? And you have this opportunity to capture those monies, those international monies, for development. So these are the locations, and then I put the coca cultivation there from a CIA document, actually. This is a 2014 map. I'm only showing the Amazonian side of Colombia. Colombia has coca in many other places, at least as documented at the time. And you can see that there's a spatial pattern. And so I guess what's interesting, or what we published in this paper, is showing that that spatial relationship persists into today, right? So that even today, in 2014, the data that we had, but it's true in 2016, 2017, and so on, is that the probability of an area having coca grows really quickly the closer it is to those ancient projects and to those development projects of the past. And showing that spatial pattern, which brings us back to that development vision. Originally, the book was, one of the titles that we had for the book was Refugees of Modernization, because the modernization, right? This was supposed to make the countries modern, right? This is going to have like a proper, you're going to have really good land connections. It's going to become, the Amazon is going to become a breadbasket. If not the Amazon, just the Ceja de Montaña. Did you talk about Ceja de Montaña? The Amazon Andes.
I'm glad you talked me out of that title.
This one is a lot catchier. But I think I wanted to bring up the refugees of modernization mostly because of the modernization vision, right? Like this modernization vision that you're going to build those roads, and you're going to, you just have all that land, and you just need to put people in it and have some kind of, technology associated with the people, and then they're going to become really productive, and it's going to become the breadbaskets. And of course, we now know that one of the things that happened is that there was a lot of migration out of those places. So there was migration in and then migration out. And the people who ended up becoming cocaleros are actually people who, who somehow persisted, right, and tried to really make a go of it, of having this campesino model in that region of the world. So here's more documentation. This is Carretera Marginal de la Selva. This is the Charter of Punta del Este. This is like the entire hemisphere is united in these goals. The United States plays an important role, again, in having the Bretton Woods institutions like the IMF have loans associated with them. There's still loans that are being paid off from that period in some cases. Yeah, you can find them online. Just how big. There was this massive amounts of influx of money that went associated with that. And you have, it's fascinating, this document from 1974, there's already evaluations that are happening already in the early 70s in Colombia. And they're already saying, environmentally, this really isn't working. And in terms of creating the social fabric that we thought, that's also not working. So I'm going to leave it there, mostly because my focus has been on trying to understand the environmental dynamics and the spatial dynamics here. And to say that, again, these centers that you see are also centers of carbon emissions. So in other words, in terms of, they have a global significance. These centers of clearings in Amazonia have a global significance for climate in the entire world. So these decisions that were made during that period to open up, and the amount of people that came in, to bring it closer to the present environmentally. And again, we're kind of now 2 degrees of separation from coca, because coca played some role in sustaining some of the economics of the regions for a while, but to the extent that things become more developed, coca starts vanishing from those places and migrates further out, or goes somewhere farther away from where all the settlements are. In the present, so last year, for the first time, since, I'm gonna go ahead and say like the Miocene, so for the first time in millions of years, this corridor of forest that goes from the Andes into this region of Amazonia, that is the corridor that enables jaguars and tapirs to maintain gene flow, lots of populations of birds. That was severed in October of 2017. And it was severed there at the skinniest point that you see. You see that white? It was severed in so in other words, these regions of Colombia that a lot of people, a lot of urban Colombia, just like a lot of urban Peru, which is kind of like out in the Pacific, right? They see places like Pucallpa as being really far away, or places like, the Guaviare Valley as being really far away. In Colombia, urban Colombians, they see Guaviare being super far away and this kind of like really nowhere place. But as we saw earlier, Guaviare is actually really becoming very developed, and it's becoming really urban, and coca is disappearing from there. But part of what goes with it is that these land connections are becoming, these forests are being cleared. So what do we do about that? Well, I think it's a system-wide problem, and I wanna kind of put it into the historical context of the closing of a frontier, because I think one of the things that's happened in Guaviare, or coca is a frontier crop, right? And coca disappears when the frontier closes, or our historical experience of coca disappearing has to do with the frontier closing, right? But I posit that the frontier of the Amazon, of Western Amazonia, is closing, and in fact, it began to close in 2010, when for the first time you could drive during the dry season from Manaus to Lima, right? You can actually drive, and that road first, once it's paved, it's gonna be year-round, and it's also meant to have an interconnection that goes to Sao Paulo and Rio. So it's gonna be the transcontinental. Now, these were some plans that were to be financed by the Chinese. Some of these are in the works. And the historical parallel is actually closer to home in the United States, of course. And it's actually like another transcontinental project. You have in 1869, right, it's the closing or the finishing, the two railroads meet, coming from Chicago to San Francisco, and it spells out the closing of the western frontier. Now, I think this is part of American history a lot of you are going to be aware of, and what it did to, on the one hand, to the natural landscapes, to indigenous people, to all a series, and it's also a huge catalyst of economic development for the then young nation. But I want to point out what happened environmentally, and here's what happened environmentally. So we get the beginning of the 1800s, you see this forest. Obviously, as you go further west, the natural habitats of that region are not forests. They're natural scrublands, grasslands, et cetera, and deserts. But if we stay closer to the Midwest, right, which is being opened up by that railroad, we see the 1800s, we see by 1840, which is when a lot of mass migration is really happening. 1870s, 1 year after the closing of that, by 1900, so 30 years roughly. By 1900, you have the forests have been reduced to like a tiny, tiny record of their former selves. And what happens as a consequence of that is that species such as the passenger pigeon that numbered in the billions go extinct. They numbered in the billions that nobody, people would have to stop working for 3 days because they covered the sky. Like, there was nothing like it in the world, and we don't have the experience of that. And this population that was so massive just vanishes, right? In part, this paper actually is about how the reason it vanished was a combination of hunting and the habitat destruction. This is in the past, and it's part of the history of the country. This process, I argue, is unfolding right now in the Amazon, in the western part of the Amazon, this closing of this frontier. And coca is part of the mix, but even if coca didn't exist, it would still be happening because it's happening through this process of economic development and through the patterns of development. And then I have a series of proposals about how to conserve the forest, but I'm gonna leave it at that. Forward to this. Yeah. The forest frontier will close, and with it, a lot of coca cultivation actually will decline in the places where the frontier, it will migrate to where there's new frontiers, right, in further into the forest. But so it's more talking about carbon and carbon pricing and what are some of the things that can be done to instigate the kind of conservation projects or the conservation vision that needs to happen, I would argue, in parallel with any sort of alternative development. Because if we have it is so one is the arc, the timeline of alternative development needs to be expanded into the decades, instead of this vision of like 3-year, 5-year projects, which have bequeathed us this parts of this problem. And then the other side of that is that if we're serious, if Norway and Germany and all of these countries are serious about forest conservation being one of those goals of that anti-drug money, then we will have to have measures in place that produce value for the forest, which at the moment, it's the cheapest option of all, to just keep clearing more. It really is the cheapest option. I mean, what incentive do I have to buy fertilizer and invest a lot of money trying to keep up the land when I can just go further in, right? And there's actually absolutely no one who needs to pay for the carbon that's been emitted and all of that. So we've been thinking of ideas about how to do that with different environmental groups. But I don't want to stray too far from the coca. Coca is part of the mix. It's part of the reason why I wound up working on this book with Paul was that finding of that relationship, that clear spatial relationship between the centers of development from 40 and 50 years ago and the places that have massive deforestation and coca cultivation today.
And we're happy to have Coletta Youngers, WOLA Senior Fellow, longtime follower and expert on drug policy, coca cultivation, to offer some comments.
Hello, everybody. I'm going to be brief because there are a lot of experts in the room here, I see, and also because my head is sort of spinning with all of that information that you just presented. And I don't know if I can articulate this well, but I feel like, we have all these arguments that we have about alternative development and why it doesn't work. And you just, gave us some tremendously useful, scientific evidence to explain why that's the case. And I hope we can talk more about how we might translate some of this into something that policymakers can use. I go every year to the UN Commission on Narcotic Drugs meeting in Vienna, which is where it's the big UN meeting on drug policy. And for years now, every year, the Colombian government has this huge display in the main hall on how coca deforests Colombia.
I've seen it. It's really graphic. It's really kind of aggressive.
So maybe do I blame you for that or no?
I'm going to pass on taking all the blame for that. I don't know if we've withdrawn. I've nuanced my views on what's going on. Yeah.
No. I won't blame you for it, but it is interesting, and now I know what to say if they do it again this coming year. But before I go any further, I just want to underscore how fascinated it is to have this combination of the work of the two of you. I, of course, have known Paul for years, and he is the historian on coca. I don't think there's anybody else who's done the kind of work that you've done in the Andes, looking at the historical context and the roots of coca and cocaine, and your work that I've not been exposed to before is absolutely fascinating. So it's a wonderful combination. It makes me think about how can we promote more academic, cross-cutting, getting different disciplines together in this kind of really unique way. I think there's just tremendous irony in all of this. I am going next week. I'm participating in a meeting organized by UNODC primarily and some others, which is a UN expert meeting on alternative development. And I've been engaged in work at the UN around alternative development for years now. They say I'm an expert, but they also see me as sort of a skunk in the garden party, as WOLA likes to say. So I'm not quite sure why I got invited this time. But anyway, I now have the opening to my presentation, which is going to be to talk about this. Because, I mean, when we talk about, yes. When we talk about, the problems of coca and cocaleros and cultivation, I mean, we do say these people come from the most marginalized, most abandoned, areas of the country. And it turns out that's, at one level, all a myth. And I think it is really fascinating to think about the historical context here where actually these were failed development projects to begin with. They were then abandoned by the state, and now the government is back trying to implement more failed development projects. And there's also this tendency on a part of a lot of governments to blame the growers, right?
Yep.
You know, the problem is that we have these people that are cultivating cocaine, and if we could just get rid of cultivating coca in this case, or poppy, and if we could just get rid of the growers, that would have a significant impact on the amount of cocaine and heroin, opioids going into the international drug trade. When in fact, what we know is that, you know, the supply is driven by drug use. And I think that's one thing you could think about sort of working into this argument, because it was interesting hearing you talk about the Guaviare. Well, of course, what happens then is the coca, you know, for a variety of different reasons,
Has
you know,
been moving to other
development
places,
being
yep.
one of them, moves to other places, and it moves between countries. And we have yet to see any significant reduction in coca cultivation over decades of both eradication and alternative development. In fact, if you look at the World Drug Report, which is the annual UN report on the state of the drug trade in the world that just came out in June, you know, basically it says we have never had, we have unprecedented levels of cultivation, of production, of trafficking and use. Which I took away. I was in New York when Fedotov, you know, the head of UNODC, presented the report. That says to me, well, we really should be rethinking our strategies. They interpret it, as the U.S. government does, as, oh, we just need to do more of the same.
Double down.
I think from that point of view, this is a real wake-up call to us that we do need to change the narrative that we often use. The other thing that, you know, so I'm going to this meeting next week, so I've been thinking a lot about alternative development and sort of the evolution of the concept over time, and and I do think that within the very small group of people who work on alternative development, that there has been an evolution of how people talk about it. You know, we went from crop substitution to alternative development to alternative livelihoods. And this idea of proper sequencing in our lingo, which basically means you need to have other sources of income in place before you eliminate, a coca growers or a poppy growers, only source of cash income. That there's in the really around, I'd say by like 2005, that was, there was a lot of discussion. A lot of people accepted that as a it makes sense, right? And that's why you get this short-term versus long-term. You can eradicate coca in the short term, but, very quickly that will be reversed because people will grow more because they have no other choice. But if you actually look at what's happening on the ground, not only has it not changed, but it's gotten worse in a way. I work a lot with Martin Gelsma from TNI, who's going to love this book. And he was doing some research that he shared with me recently. If you go back to development projects back in the 60s and 70s, when, which is an interesting sort of when these projects were failing and when alternative development was coming in, there was much more tolerance of you may have, you have your coca, but we're also doing, we're doing development projects at the same time. Now it's basically zero tolerance with very few exceptions. And despite this idea that everybody says, yeah, proper sequencing makes a lot of sense, in practice, I can only think of 2 countries in the world that actually do that. And maybe I'm forgetting somebody, but you have Thailand, which is sort of the classic success story of a very long term, which your point is really important. These are long-term processes. You can't change these economies overnight, despite the Colombian government's recent effort to do that. But Thailand, which embarked on this very long-term development program and was quite successful over the long term in eliminating poppy production in that country. Of course, it spread other places. And then more recently, we have the case of Bolivia, where, and it's interesting because the Bolivians haven't been real engaged in these debates that I'm talking about that have been happening at the international level. So I don't think they thought, oh, well, we've learned we need to focus on economic development. That's just what made sense to them, when began a little before Evo Morales came into office. But so you've had this, tremendous economic development in the Chapare in particular, at the same time that they've been able to stabilize coca production. So I think that there is, Let me just make one more point before I wrap up. And the other thing I think that we really have to come to grips with, that we talk about the problem of proper sequencing, but I think what we really have to talk about is the incompatibility between development and drug control efforts, which is not to say you abandon drug control efforts, but if you are trying to turn around a situation like the Guaviare, which would be interesting to get much more in depth into that case study, but if you have an area where there's predominantly coca growing, you don't have a lot of other economic opportunities, you need to work with local communities. You need to, those farmers need to be involved every step of the way in designing, implementing, evaluating, monitoring these projects. They're the stakeholders. In my previous life, before I came to WOLA, I worked for a development organization in Peru, and it was just, community development is what we know, works in many cases. And yet, if you are criminalizing those people, if you are at the same time that you're saying, we're going to give you, these rabbits, but we're going to wipe out all your crops, they're not going to be partners in development.
Good luck with the rabbits, yeah.
And I won't get into the kinds of alternative development projects that we have that are totally inadequate for, replacing that income. So anyway, I'll stop there and just reiterate that I think that this is fascinating research, and I really want to work with you guys in figuring out how we sort of put it in more, policy recommendation terms for at the UN level, but also with local governments.
Right.
Adam, back to you.
That was excellent. Thank you, Coletta, and thanks to both of you. This is great. Now, I'm not even going to, normally when I moderate, I'm like, I'm going to take the first question. I will not do that because we've got an amazing crowd here with great questions. That said, I will raise just a couple points that if you could touch on them, it would be wonderful. One, I'm thinking a lot about Colombia right now, where you've had this large increase in coca cultivation, more than double according to U.S. and UN estimates since 2013. It's happening in the same municipalities as always. The coca is increasing in the same places. It's not really popping up anywhere new, which may or may not, Liliana, contradict with your finding that once an area sort of matures more economically, that it moves on somewhere else. We're not seeing that. You're seeing more emphasis on places that had already seen coca in the Pacific showing more, maybe more than the Amazon. But anyway, I'd like to see how you address that. Also, I wonder if there's any sort of control group countries. We often get asked, why is there no coca in Venezuela or Panama or Ecuador? And is it because they didn't even attempt to do alternative development projects in those areas? Because that would be fascinating. And finally, I mean, we're talking about failed development projects being, big ambitions that get thrown away, being a real catalyst here. We're seeing one of those embark in the context of the Peace Accord, something that we here at WOLA very much support. But you have programs like the National Integrated Substitution Program, the PENIS, the development plans of the territorial focus, the PEDETs. A lot of investment is going to go in to a lot of previously and maybe heretofore marginal areas. And are we going to be seeing the same movie? Don't answer those. I'm going to actually open the throw in your 2 cents if you want, but. Sure. I'll restate the question first.
Great discussion. I have questions for each of you. So, for Paul, I had a question. Yes, it's failed development of what the state had in mind, but this cocoa industry is one of the greatest cases I've ever seen of illicit entrepreneurship, of somebody coming from a rural area and building really a world-class business out of it. And I wondered if you looked at this issue and thought about, the entrepreneurship that came in these communities that allowed them to take this crop and move it globally. And so that's the first question. And for Liliana, I had a question on, do we know where this development capital is coming from in terms of the land? I know that Francisco had written at some point of money laundering into ranching. And is some of this development money part of what was generated through the drug trade and then laundered? And one of my doctoral students is a Colombian who's working on land grabbing and is doing some analysis of the people behind this. And there's more involvement of some of the criminal networks
Let me just restate the questions for those who will be watching this recording in the future. Louise Shelley asked Paul about these failed development projects, but also about whether coca is a result of sort of a model of illicit entrepreneurship, that people are actually coming up and inserting themselves in a global economy in a very creative way. And Liliana asked whether, if I can read where is this development capital for these cultivations and for these projects coming from, especially when it has to do with land? Is a lot of this drug money being laundered? What would the source be?
Yeah.
Oh, by the way, Adam, I do have an answer to your Ecuador question, which is that, in fact, Ecuador, of the 3 countries, of the 4 Andean nations, was the one to have the least drive towards the Amazon during this developmental period. And their development projects were towards the Pacific.
Yeah.
So it actually reinforces the model. But I wouldn't be surprised now if Ecuador explodes in coca, and Venezuela as well. Yeah, I'm a little skeptical, Louise, about thinking of this as a hotbed of entrepreneurialism, in the sense that almost every model that's, since the very beginning, that's ever been done of where the income streams are in the illicit drug trade is one of tremendous inequalities. That is, the people at the far end in the Amazon are more like survivalists. They're the ones, they may be more entrepreneurial people in the sense that they decided, we're going to stick it out here, like exactly what these ethnographies are trying to show. We're going to stick it out here, and this is the only thing we have. But they're not getting rich from this. The people who get rich on the illicit trades are the middlemen, and then the higher up distributors. Yeah, and it's exponential at every level, in every study that's ever been shown of the illicit trades, and the people at the bottom are basically screwed. And so I don't think, I mean, it shows some survival instinct and coherence, and the arguments are being made sometimes by anthropologists now that I sometimes encounter, that these are real communities, they're showing real creativity, but when you're really trying to consolidate yourself as a community, you try to move out of risky things like coca, and you try to move into other things. So yeah, there's some degree of that, but the real, the kind of savage capitalist entrepreneurs were the, 80s, Medellin and Cali type of people. I don't really think that we want to, use that as a model for development in any Andean state. But that would be my answer to that. It certainly does exist to some degree, but it's not a very happy picture.
So I want to take on that question about the, what are the, if there are these land grabs, right? Where is the money coming from for actually like clearing the land, appropriating it, and somehow? So I want to draw. So most people aren't going to be able to see. So I'm going to look for it in my. It's not my computer, so never mind. So it's not my computer, so I can't show it to you. But you can pass it along. So this is like a stylized trajectory of the way that the forest gets cleared, right? And so you basically have an expansive forest. Like, for example, right now, currently the Valpes in Colombia, like it's still sort of, it's just got like the occasional person that's gone to live in the wilderness, and then the indigenous people that are living in there, right? And then you have a frontier, like a very lightly populated frontier that's got those clearings. And that we see some of that like in the far ends of Vichada, for example, like some of those Meta Guaviare coca pops up in this far, further in, right? It pops like little bits of crops. They're relatively easy to eliminate, because they're not integrated so well into the networks. Then the next stage is where you actually have the Cocalero frontier, when you actually have more of that migration, and that's, there's more people there. And then there's the final step where you end up having like a tiny proportion of forest. So most of the forest gets cleared, and then you have the properties. This transition between the two middle stages and the end, that's the land grabbing right there. And that's where a bunch of laundering happens, and that's when a bunch of, so one of the critical, in this case of this case study of Guaviare, right, we're sticking, or the thing that I presented, I'm sticking to what we can get data for, right? There are the things that we can't really get solid data, but that are there nonetheless. What are some of those factors that are there on the land? So one of them is the extension of roads that began under the Uribe administration that was part of a large scandal within Colombia because, you know, his family happened to purchase a lot of this land cheaply right before the plans were announced for the construction of these giant roads, right? And then, so they became instantly, you know, tremendously rich. The property prices started, you know, the property prices across the roads that fork out like into that region, like one goes into Meta and the other one goes down into Guaviare, skyrocketed the, you know, land near the road, but then of course it keeps going, you know, further out. Even though those lands are technically, they don't belong to anybody. Technically they're the state. Technically they're part of the forest reserve for the most part, with some exceptions. So there was this, you know, very corrupt deal that happens there. This crony capitalism happens. This crony capitalism means that giant conglomerates from the settled parts of Colombia, right, come out and buy the rights to, you know, off of whoever, you know, if you're a cocalero and you had your clearing, they will buy it off you or they will shove you off. You know, if you don't sell the rights, they will push you out, right, of the land, so that now we can put in mechanization and we can put very capital intensive, very labor non-intensive, very labor poor, very capital intensive agriculture. And that is, you know, the only time that I've gotten in trouble was by stating that. You know, all these years, like I spent 10 years going around talking about how coca was this terrible thing for the forest, et cetera, et cetera. And then I gave one interview in which I said, you know what, I talk a lot about coca, but coca's like a really tiny proportion of the forest. You saw the numbers of the deforestation rates coming out of coca. You see the numbers of all of that. And it's really like a fraction. It's a fraction we like to focus on because it's illegal, and we got data because it's illegal. We got lots of data. But then I said, I want to talk about oil palm. And I want to talk about how those environments are getting really, you know, these environments are being transformed and the water table is lowering and all of that. And that's the only time I've had people from the Oil Palm Federation actually contacting me, journalists hounding me at home, like calling me on my phone and actually asking for like public apologies and all of that, because, you know, there may be narcopolitica, but there certainly isn't anybody lobbying for the coca in Congress like there is a federation. So we have land grabs associated with that, you know, for these are, you know, documented to a certain degree, like NGOs document some of those land grabs. There's actually really good documentation of in Chocó, land grabs that have been associated with the different agro industries, but they're actually really hard to document quantitatively and kind of put them as a series of numbers that we can correlate. That's actually rather hard to do, and it's something that we have been unable to do. But we know that those factors, we know that these actions exist. The extent to which they can explain the majority of the changes that we see, to me, it remains unknown. But we know they exist. We know, you know, we know they could be behind important changes in these places. I just can't tell you with the same clarity that I can tell you that the road has changed the tax base of that place. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm Francisco Toomey. I'm a member of the International Narcotics Control Board. A very atypical member. Now, you challenged me today in many ways. What you describe is a process that has no real cause and effects, no direct causes and not effect. Yeah. Okay. I mean, what you talk about is about processes that have many factors that can act as the triggers. So you don't have direct cause and effects. And I mean, this is why all this debate as to whether coca is the main factor in the deforesting Colombia and so on. So it's the issue here, I think, is to try to understand the process and how it develops. For example, in Colombia, there was always this land grab attitude. I mean, Colombia, I don't think, has overcome the colonization, the colony of the country. In 1972, for example, after about 8 years of trying to implement a land reform, that was completely wiped out with a deal between landlords, business people, and the government in the famous Chicoral Pact. I mean, Colombia in that sense was the only country, only large country with a lot of peasantry in Latin America that never had a meaningful land reform. And they turned the land reform into a colonization program. I mean, I think that's independent of the marginal theory of the marginal route of the Marginal de la Selva. I mean, in the early 70s, I worked in the planning office in Colombia, and the main issue there in terms of infrastructure and roads was how to reach the ports. Okay, how to build the railroad to Barranquilla through the Magdalena River. There was no real discussion about colonizing the east part of the country. In the case of Bolivia, I think that the main project really didn't have to do that much with the Marginal de la Selva either. But I mean, basically the highway was the highway that joined La Paz, Cochabamba, and Santa Cruz. It was basically an urban project, and that was funded by the Inter-American Development Bank and the World Bank. And there's this old story that when there was an American delegation from Congress that visited the recently built route, and they asked the peasants if they think that it was good, and the answer was yes, of course. This morning, a small airplane came and landed, and then it took off. So I mean, the stories there are very complex in many ways. The the process that Liliana, you describe basically leads to a complete wiping out of the forest in Colombia. And the way you presented it, there is no hope. So I want to look at the epilogue of the book, which basically means how can these countries, in terms of my interest, especially Colombia, learn to live in a world where cocaine is illegal without destroying the country in the process. And I think that that is the challenge we face.
Let me say, it's amazing to have you here because you're like a primary source in our research, especially your work in the development office. I had no idea of that. So thank you for coming.
For 2 years, Fernando Belaúnde and myself were the only two Latin Americans professors at George Washington.
Okay, yes, and you knew him as well.
overlap with him.
But I just wanted to say that your point is very well taken about the national differences. I mean, one of the things that we try to avoid in the book, a lot of people come at this type of problem and they say, we know the answer. It's the Cold War. We know the answer. It's just, development with a capital D. But in fact, the narratives in the three countries is where it gets so, it's so different, and the details are fascinating. And so the national politics of agrarian reform really matters in Colombia versus Bolivia versus Peru. But this is where it gets even more interesting for people like Liliana and I, who are kind of oddly social scientists at heart, which is, despite these differences, which really matter, you're right about that, about the national politics of agrarian reform in Colombia, which is part of the case studies that we have here. You still see these striking similarities in terms of the outcome. And the outcome that you see there on the maps, that these three zones become the generating zones of the cocaine boom. And it's within this macro world where cocaine is illegal. So I agree with your points. Whether or not there's hope, I would defer that to my colleague.
Yeah, I don't know about the hope. So yeah, I agree. I concur with everything that Paul said. It's very valuable to have like firsthand testimony from what was going on in those offices at the time compared to like what's written after the fact, especially from some of these sources that we looked. I have no doubt in my mind that in any given country you have like you have people actually migrating, you have local authorities doing whatever they do, you have central authorities, and then you have this macro level, right? So what we've put together, and particularly like in sort of overall in the book, is thinking about that promise of modernization and the crystallization of a series of of projects that actually had some footprint on the ground, whether or not they occupied the mind of particular people at particular point in the central government. That's another question, and it's something that also kind of goes back to the question of Ecuador, like what happened in Ecuador. So pointedly, I don't have the development projects of Ecuador, in part because of the choices that even the researchers at the time who were compiling this data, this 1970s papers, they were saying there's so much underinvestment in Ecuador that is happening that we don't even want to count them. There's underinvestment, and they're going west, and the ones that are going east, they're just oil. They're oil all the time. And there was a parallel there a little bit with Putumayo in Colombia. Like there was a little bit of that going on. So in other words, I don't want to leave people with a sense, and I try to kind of walk that fine line with a sense that this one catalyst is the one thing. This is the one thing. It's more of a sense of a historical process that inserts itself and is eerily parallel to these notions of alternative development today. So it's a very forward-looking vision of saying we've been down this road of how migration is going to do certain things, how development is going to do certain things, and we have watched that unfold in its own special way in each country, but have a similar result in the end. Like even in situations where there were alternative things, like there were alternative sources of income for people, like in Putumayo. So I want to get to the issue of hopelessness because, of course, I skipped over the hopeful part. So I think I want to get to the issue of hopelessness because, okay, so I want to say a couple things. So the first one is that we cannot say that it's hopeless because the Andean part of Colombia, which harbors the majority of Colombia's population, still has forest. And this is an area where so-called civil society. So not just, it's kind of like in the US where the East has like the tiny national parks, right? They're tiny, and one of the national parks is on Wall Street, right? Because, there's a park, and then you go out west and there's the giant parks, right? So why did that happen? Well, that happened because this is where the people have been concentrated, and this is where people partitioned off the land and created, cities and big roads and all of that, right? And then as you went west, then the federal government said, this is mine, this is mine, this is mine, and created parks out of that. So within Colombia, the Andean region, which has so much population, has so much development, nevertheless has parks. A few of them are government, but there's such substantial chunks of habitats and ecosystems that have become actually more important in the last 40 years, in part because of the collapse of the coffee market, right? Of actually private owners linking in with NGOs and turning over their farms, right? Because their farms were no longer bringing in the international the revenue that they did, and turning them over to internal domestic Colombian tourism. And it's a relatively, it was a huge adjustment and it created all kinds of dislocation. But it's a success story in terms of some social sustainability, some environmental sustainability. So what that means is that even in the circumstances that would lead to this, complete clearance, right? That hasn't happened, and it hasn't happened because people have cared. In a way, I feel like the only way that we have for protecting, and there's more slides to that, but I'd rather just kind of talk about it. The only way that we are going to save large chunks of the Amazon is if it's populated, not if it's depopulated. It's very easy to clear it now because it's depopulated, because there's few people, because a lot of the communities are cocaleros, and therefore very easy to shove around, very easy to throw, government forces at them, very easy to do all of that. To the extent that they become more populated, so to the extent that Guaviare becomes a more important urban hub, and because people start reacting to that. And one of those reactions, and then there's the ability to actually go in and work together with people, and they themselves self-organize and say, you know what, things are changing. We're actually seeing, the animals go away, we're actually seeing the water table lower, we're gonna do something about it. So the parts of the Amazon that are gonna be saved not because they don't have people, but because they have people who care about them. So I actually believe that that will be the case. My vision, or transmitting this vision of the closing of the frontier, is I wanna bring an alarm because each one of us has grown up in a world in which we periodically hear, whenever we're not distracted by whatever the latest bit of news is, that the Amazon is disappearing, and we should all be sad about the Amazon and all of that. But I want to bring that relevance of, hey, it's really happening. It's really, it's not about, it's no longer remote. There are areas, these areas of wilderness that have been completely turned over in all of that. And what the Western Amazon, from my standpoint, from the conservation biologist standpoint, there's a lot of focus on Brazil, and a lot of, thinking about the state of Acre and all of that, and not a lot of attention to the Western Amazon. So I want to draw that attention and show the Western Amazon is the roads to the ports. There's not going to be, there is that land interconnection now going to Lima. There's going to be one to Guayaquil. There's going to be one to Buenaventura. It's only a matter of time. And each one of those steps brings us closer, towards that limiting of the Amazon. So the time to act is now, to be proactive and to say, yes, we need more people, not fewer people. We need more people on the Amazon. But then we also need to be thinking about how do we work with the people that are living in the Amazon to conserve something that profits them, that benefits them.
Just to phrase the question, because you weren't on the mic, Sanho Tree from the Institute for Policy Studies asked about, Taiwan and Indonesia were prominent coca growers a century ago. What are the future directions of coca? Is it always going to be an Andean phenomenon? What about sub-Saharan Africa, for instance?
Thank you. I dealt with that question a lot in my first book, Andean Cocaine, because I was looking at the kind of imperial interests that were swirling in the world at the beginning of the 20th century, why coca became a colonial Japanese and Dutch crop. And I came to the conclusion there, analytically, I'm trying to remember back, That the difference there, why it was able to be shut down, is that it was a large-scale plantation crop, and then these military occupations came in, and it was dealt with really by military fiat and kind of just disappeared. They say that by the late 40s, you could just find like little patches of coca bushes every once in a while that were feral in Taiwan and things like that. And so in my mind, I always contrasted that with the Andes, where you had these agents, more autonomous, which were these campesinos who were moving down into the Amazon, and not large plantations. Only for a short time in Peru at the beginning of the late 19th century, early 20th century, were there large coca plantations, or the type of large coca plantations that used to exist in the yungas of Bolivia until the revolution. So there was a very different sociological difference between these zones, but I agree with the fundamental point. There is nothing intrinsically cultural or biological that says that coca has to stay in the Andes. I tried to make this point like 5 or 6 years ago to a group of DEA type people. I was invited, I think I was telling Adam that I was invited to this strange secret meeting of them, and they just laughed at me when I brought up that point, that there is nothing to prevent coca from becoming a global commodity again.
Right.
And they just laughed at me, like, who are you saying this nonsense to us? Of course, we'll be able to see it on our satellites and stuff like that. But I still think, first of all, there's still plenty of room for this to continue to play out, as Adam said, in the Andes. And you do have these established routes and marketing, and it's really expanding in new ways with the Brazilian connection. That's what I've been writing and thinking about the most, is that Brazil is becoming, in some sense, I mean, I don't want to be quoted as the new Colombia, in the sense of becoming an organizing and trafficking pole for this Amazonian coca, which is moving south. I called it shifting south in an article that I published last year, which, oh no, I haven't published it yet. I'm sorry. It's about to be published. Anyway,
In your mind,
so
it's
in my mind it was published, but if you want it, I'll pass it on to you.
Your mind is peer reviewing, right?
Your mind's peer reviewed.
No, it was peer reviewed. Anyway, she's read it. She knows it's not just a
I've read it,
figment
yeah,
of
I've
my
read it.
imagination. But I agree with you that
It exists, it exists.
It exists. I agree with you that potentially this could happen anywhere. It is a crop that anywhere where tea grows, and if you look at the you know, the ecological belts of the world, anywhere that tea grows, coca can grow well. So that's a lot of territory. It's like saying the whole coffee tea belt of, you know, the tropical world. And I guess it depends on entrepreneurs. Like, if there are groups of illicit entrepreneurs who decide that this thing could be done on a massive scale, it would take a while to start up, though, because it takes, like, you know, 5 years or so for this to come online. And, you know, it would be, at the moment, I don't think it's really necessary. There's a lot of surplus coca in the Americas. But in the long run, if they do double down and they just burn down the entire Andes looking to, you know, eradicate coca, then it will just go somewhere else. I agree.
Yeah, there's no shame in leaving if you have to, because we didn't plan to go this long, but this is such a great conversation. Yes.
Hi everyone, Matt Pendleton, historian, mostly U.S. drug enforcement. I've got 2 questions for you guys. One that's sort of more specific and easy, and one that's a bit more speculative. I think kind of goes back to this question about the future of cocaine. The easy one, my understanding is that marijuana kind of carved out a lot of the illicit channels into the United States, and did you find evidence of that agriculturally in this period that your team was looking at? And if so, what was the ecological impact there? And then the second question is, you know, development programs rarely go exactly as planned, and it sounds like you're suggesting that if the urbanization and sort of actually settling the frontier is one of the ways to kind of shut this stuff down and to prevent further deforestation. If these programs had gone as planned, would that have prevented the rise of this big cocaine boom, or would it just have shown up somewhere else further out on the frontier?
Just to quickly restate, the first question was about whether marijuana has carved out initial agricultural channels in these areas. And then if these development programs had gone as planned, would the history have been a lot different?
That's a mind-boggling question, the second one. I don't know if I have an answer to that, but the thing about marijuana.
Pick the first then.
Yeah, I'll stick to the small one. There were, in Colombia it was called the marimbero booms.
The boom.
Well, there's more than one, and but to my mind, the evidence so far, a lot of people in Colombia like to say that they were related and that they were intimately related, and a lot of people in Colombia also like to say, oh, the Americans did it.
Oh, yeah, the Americans brought the
Brought the
yeah,
seed, and
that's
they
another
brought,
thing.
there was pilots from Vietnam, and there are all
Yeah,
these
yeah,
conspiracy
people, yeah.
theories all the time. I think that's kind of nonsense. I mean, yeah, the Americans did it in the sense that we cracked down on Mexican marijuana, which created this tremendous market opportunity for Santa Marta and these regions. But there was a coeval marimbero boom down in Cauca, I think it was, for a short time as well. But they seem to be quite different circuits. My argument that I've seen over years is that coca comes from the Peruvian and Bolivian experience, and then the networks that are created and the technologies that are created move north and are captured in Colombia. But the different circuits stay separate, so one is not capitalizing the other, or even, there's not even a lot of evidence. There's one or two of the major traffickers of the 1970s who had prior experience in marijuana. But it mainly comes from just this homegrown entrepreneurial, like I'm reading another biography by the son of Pablo Escobar, and you're just stunned by oh yeah, they're good at inventing this stuff. They're really, really good at understanding how to smuggle and how to start taking advantage of these opportunities. Today, however, there seems to be a lot of marijuana in Colombia again.
Yeah.
And they're seeing, and the government is also talking about the global legal, they're one of the 5 nations internationally that are trying to poison themselves to be marijuana superpowers. Colombia, medical marijuana.
Yeah.
Jamaica, Chile, Israel, Holland, Canada, they're all trying to capture this market. But I haven't seen much of that. But as far as your second question, that's a mind-bogglingly good analytical question. I mean, if this development had turned out right, would we have never seen cocaine in the Andes? It's so hard to say, really, because it.
What would I guess I would like to more kind of try to think about what going right would be. Like going right, it would be absorbing all of that population that's draining out of the Andes. In Colombia, violently.
Yeah.
In Peru, a little less, and then in Bolivia, a little less so, right? Violently, throwing out masses of population are coming out in migration. They're displaced. Some of the people are coming in into those projects. They don't know. There's all these chronicles from the period. They don't really know. Some of them are thinking that it's some kind of compensation as opposed to an agricultural credit where they're going to grow. So if that had gone right, it was people would immediately realize that it's an agricultural credit and that they need to use it to improve the land as opposed to just kind of pocket it to, as a restitution for the losses that they've had in the Interandean valleys from, having been thrown off the land. So they would have got that right, and then they would have got the technology right? That it turns out that this Amazon Andes resembles parts of the Amazon more than it resembles the Andean soils and the Interandean Valley soils that they're familiar with and the rainfall. And then the investment would have been sufficient to have proper roads that work year-round, that enable them to actually sell the products from market that they're getting from all of that technology that they're receiving or that they're actually implementing themselves. And it would have absorbed a significant amount of the population as opposed to just a tiny trickle, because there was a lot of return migration. People just went back and some left. So that's what success would look like. So in other words, it would be economically integrated places. We see that around Santa Cruz. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that there are aspects that have been successful at some level. So in places around Santa Cruz, you see, okay, over the years, the roads finally got to the point where they're actually competitive with those markets and they actually sell the products to market. There's a little bit of that going on even in Guaviare. The road got improved, and there's a little bit of that going on, right? Some success happened. It's just been really slow to take. Really, really slow, and it's required, like a lot more money. It's kind of one of those visions, like it's just required a lot more. So that's what it would take.
Just wanted to add my 2 cents to that. So I think we have to remember that there's two different, in addition to sort of these, particular agricultural projects that you're talking about, there's two other phenomena at play. One is, the international, what I referred to before, this is an international phenomenon, this is an international drug trade. And,
Right. And demand.
there, I firmly believe that demand ensures that there will be a steady supply from somewhere. And of course, Peru and Bolivia were the logical places to start, because what we haven't talked about, but I'm sure you all know, is that there is historic traditional, use of coca in those countries. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I also think that these coca growing regions reflect failed development models more broadly, or the way in which capitalism developed in these countries. Because if you think, for example, about the Chapare of Bolivia, I mean, what transformed the Chapare was the closing down of all the mines, and all those people flooded into the Chapare, and they became the coca growers. And you've alluded to that, in Colombia and Peru, we've seen this tremendous migration where people are migrating to areas where they haven't been able to make a living where they are, and where they think they can. So I think those factors feed in as well. And I've also been thinking it's interesting to think about, like, your Guaviare story. It's very similar in Bolivia. Once you're able to grow a certain amount of coca and can start accumulating some cash, then you can go.
Yep.
Because I was thinking about, Nisha and I were in the Guaviare a couple years ago, but my first trip was in '96.
Yeah, it's very different. It's a
And
different
it was
approach.
this tiny little town. There was no paved roads. It was tiny. I was followed by paramilitaries on a motorcycle, paramilitary on a motorcycle the whole time. I mean, you couldn't. The city was dangerous, but people had their coca around the Guaviare. And now when we went back, I hadn't been back in 20 years. It's this bustling, I won't say metropolis, but it's certainly a small city.
The Opera House comes next.
But the coca income has allowed that to happen, just like it's allowed farmers in Bolivia to start diversifying and engaging in other economic activities.
But to just bounce off that point, one of the fascinating stories about Chapare, which Millington documents here, I mean, we've known for a long time that there was this connection between the ex-miners and the colonization of the Chapare. But unlike the other two regions we were looking at in Colombia and Peru, the people who went down in the Chapare organized themselves from
Right.
almost the very beginning. And
Right.
so instead of depending on the state, which had virtually collapsed during the Bolivian Revolution and after, they started these things called sindicatos. There were different names for them, and municipalities. And if you think about that in the larger historical arc, without romanticizing what's going on in Bolivia today, what happens after 2000 is actually, these are organized communities that are politically organized against the drug war, the international drug war, which is earliest exhausted in Bolivia, and they're the ones that offer an alternative vision of what local development is going to be, and it reaches all the way back to the mines.
Yeah.
And making your own community. So there was a much stronger sense of local political community. I don't know if they were poorer or richer than campesinos in the Huallaga, who seem to have been decimated more than anything.
But it's that history of organization, I think,
It's
that's
that-
the difference, because you didn't have that in Peru. Bolivia, you had the strong.
Yes, in Peru, the state was
History of
constantly coming down and destroying and the presence of Sendero Luminoso and the Tupac Amaru movement made it even worse in terms of the destruction that was wrought on any form of autonomous organization. Even to this day, in Peru, it's very difficult to organize sindicatos of cocaleros.
Although the cocaleros and the brine are on strike today.
No cocaine?
So one thing that I think we haven't touched upon, and I just want to kind of put out there is like that it's the kind of withdrawal of the state as a force for the withdrawal of the state as a force that happens over the course of the 1980s. So this report that I'm citing here, like at the top, it's a report from the institution in Colombia that was in charge of agrarian reform. And it went through, of course, several incarnations, and there was like, there's also many incarnations of rural development plans that are detailed in one of the chapters in the book. But you have this really very strong, and it's happening in the three countries, and for different reasons in each country. So in Peru, it's happening, they have a currency crisis, they have a debt crisis, Bolivia is happening, and then you just have this real disappearance of the institutions that were supposed to be in place. And so Maria Clara Torres in her chapter actually talks about institutions that were in place related to the projects, for example, in Meta, in Guaviare, that people actually had a real connection to those institutions. They were really positive about those government institutions that were providing some kind of support. And these just vanish. They just kind of disappear and withdraw. The whatever support existed just kind of disappears really quickly. And you have these populations. I think it's very important point that Coletta brings up of self-organization and the degree to which people are capable of self-organizing. But there's also this situation in which people, however they may self-organize, they actually have this connection to the state somehow, and that connection vanishes. It really erodes and then it disappears.
Yeah, it's double-edged. They're both dependent on the state when they go down there, and that dependence on the state turns into this type of alienation when it disappears very quickly. And in the Peruvian case, it's very dramatic because the Velasco government was very invested in, okay, we're going to deepen the colonization projects, and it's going to be part of the twin of the agrarian reform, and there's this radical agrarian reform from above, and so tens of thousands of people are streaming into Tingo Maria again, and then overnight, because of the debt crisis,
Right.
like in '74, all of those things are bankrupt, and the state just disappears from the region. So it's going back to this original question that you posed near the beginning. It's not about the original lack of state. It's about this kind of erratic presence of the state and state commitments, and the same thing has been posed, by the way, by social scientists for the origins of insurgencies.
Right.
Insurgencies come about when the state is suddenly withdrawn from, like that was one of the big theories of Sendero Luminoso. If the state has withdrawn from Ayacucho, and therefore people are angry at the bottom. Well, there's a similar dynamic going on here, but maybe the anger is expressed in different ways, which is, well, what the hell, I'll just grow coca. Who cares? There's no law here anyway. There are no institutions of justice. We're getting no help whatsoever. We have to do this on our own. So,
And
Yeah.
it was a legitimate crop.
and it was a
Peru, wasn't it?
legitimate crop, and especially in eastern Peru and Bolivia, yes, and it grew well.
Well, thank you all so much for coming. This is a great discussion. Congratulations on the publication of The Origins of Cocaine. It's a huge contribution.
Thank you. Excuse me, which way is the restroom?
As much as we